Welcome to the Becoming Superhuman podcast, where we interview extraordinary people to bring you the skills and strategies to overcome the impossible. And now, here's your host, Jonathan Levy.
This episode is brought to you by Organifi. You guys, one of the only things that every nutritional expert that we've had on the show seems to actually agree on is that we all need to eat more vegetables, eat more greens, eat organic, cut out all the processed junk. Well, who has the time, right? Who has the time to go out, do the shopping, make the salads, make the juices, make the smoothies? And that's what I love so much about Organifi. Their product is an all-organic green juice. It has all of the nutrients that you need. It tastes absolutely amazing, and it's made by wonderful people who I consider to be personal friends. And as listeners of this show, you guys can actually save 20% on your first order. And all you have to do is go to Organifi.com. That's ORGANIFI.com and use the coupon code SuperHuman at checkout. This episode is brought to you by Become a Super Learner, the Masterclass. You guys, if you have ever wanted to learn things faster, to read faster and waste less time reading boring textbooks, if you've ever wanted to have near perfect memory for names, numbers, anything you want to learn, and expand your mind and retain information in a way that you never thought possible, well, then the Become a Super Learner Masterclass is exactly what you've been looking for. It's a 10-week program developed by myself and my mentors alongside some of the world's best memory experts and world record-holding memory champions. It'll take you from zero to super learning hero in just a matter of 10 weeks in about 30 minutes a day or less. Now, you can go ahead and sign up for a free trial with no credit card required. All you have to do is go to jle.vi/learn. And if you choose to pick up the full course, you will also get an incredible discount for listeners of this podcast only. So please make sure to check it out and support the show. And on to today's episode. Greetings, super friends, and welcome to this week's episode. You guys remember the deal. One new review, one new episode, and this week's episode is graciously delivered to you because of a review from Mark Croft 78 from the United Kingdom. He says, the best self-development and enlightenment podcast, 5 stars. Becoming Superhuman podcast has been the first podcast I've subscribed to 2 years ago. From that day, I haven't missed any of your episodes. The quality of the interviews, the knowledge of the people invited is nothing short of amazing. He goes on to say that I've had a massive impact on his life and his personal development, and that he's grateful. Well, Mark, I am grateful to have been a part of your journey and for your very, very kind words. For any of you out there who also would like to keep the podcast episodes coming, one review, one additional episode. So guys, on to this week's episode. You guys, today we are joined by Jon Levy. Not me, but my much cooler, much more socially developed doppelganger in New York City. We've had Jon on the show before, but we were so caught up talking about his book, The 2 a.m. Adventure Principle, that we didn't actually get to talk about what he does normally when he's not promoting a book, and that is behavioral science. So in the episode, we go very deep into a lot of different aspects of behavioral science and how you can use it to achieve superhuman results, whether that means in your personal life, in your professional life, happiness, health, wealth, and success. I learned a lot of really, really interesting things, and Jon is just a fountain of bringing out research and psychological concepts and ideas and explaining them in a way that you can not only understand, but also apply them in your day-to-day life. So we learn how you can enjoy experiences more, how you can build better, richer relationships, and everything in between. I think you guys are really going to enjoy the episode. So without any further ado, my doppelganger, Jon Levy. Mr. Jon Levy, welcome back to the show, my friend. How have you been recently?
I've been incredible. I just got back from a 3-month, 13-country tour of the world, and finally getting to come home and dig into my latest projects. So I'm just generally excited.
Amazing. So I want to hear a little bit about these projects before we get into today's topic. What are you working on now that the 2 a.m. adventure is out into the world and hopefully succeeding and all that stuff?
So, as you know, I focus on the application of human behavioral science. So we take scientific research that's generally done by people way smarter than me, like the Dan Kahneman, the Dan Ariely's, the Robert Cialdini's of the world, and we look at how to apply it to make life better, either through better performance or more fun and exciting. And so I wrote a book called The 2 a.m. Principle, and now about discovering the science of adventure. And now it looks like it's being turned into a TV show.
Very cool. Congrats.
Thank you. Assuming all goes well, there's going to be a much better looking version of me, probably not with my name, but living this adventurous life as a scripted TV show on one of people's favorite networks.
Oh, wow. Very, very cool. When can we expect to see that?
You know, everything takes so long to do. So even if it gets picked up, we're still talking like a year or two until people see it. But it's just really exciting and flattering that it was interesting enough for people to want to see a live action version.
Incredible. I'm actually surprised that you yourself, after the stories you told us in the last episode, I'm surprised that you yourself will not be the one in the show. And I'm surprised that it needs to be scripted.
The idea of me doing it is, I don't think that I fit in the right demo. Like, I'm in my late 30s at this point. And so I think people want to see a person in his awkward 20s trying to figure out life. And that's where most of my stories took place in the book.
Fair enough.
But yeah, it's been an exciting journey. You know, one of the things that we know about human beings is, my hunch is that you've discussed the work of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi about flow state.
Flow and
is that for people to enter the state of peak human performance, there are essentially 3 minimum characteristics. One is that you have to be doing something that requires skill. You have to have some experience in it, and whatever you're doing needs to be outside of that level of experience so that you're outside of your comfort zone. And the third characteristic is that it can't be so hard that you're failing constantly, because then you get self-conscious. And so, you know, after spending years writing this book, this is kind of that experience of getting to enjoy and be fully engaged in something I really care about, right? It's something that I'm an expert in, but it's totally outside of my skill set, yet I have enough skill to kind of navigate it. And so it's making my work really exciting.
Fascinating.
And in general, if you ever want your work to be exciting, you need to be doing something that pushes the boundaries of your comfort zone. You can't come in and, you know, do the same activity day in, day out. You'll get bored and you'll just be a participant in your life. And so I constantly look for projects that I'm underskilled for, but skilled enough that I know I could get it done.
I like that, because I think one of the balances that I play with in my own business, and I was thinking about this today, is, you know, you want to stay focused in life, and especially in business, especially as a small business or entrepreneur. You want to stay focused and you want to do the things that you're good at and not now, you know, completely put yourself out into something that you have no business being in. But at the same time, you have to find that balance, because you do get bored doing the same thing. It's like no entrepreneur ever put their feet back and was like, well, the business runs well and I'm perfectly happy. It's always about growth, and it's always about challenging yourself in new ways. So like, I love that kind of focus, that mindset of, okay, it needs to be just a certain amount outside of my comfort zone to keep things interesting, to keep me engaged.
Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you know, you hear these, if you've ever read The Hard Thing About Hard Things, the book by, is it Ben Horowitz?
Sounds familiar, yeah.
It's the most honest depiction of being an entrepreneur I've ever seen. And every chapter of the book is just him dealing with failure. Sometimes that's what you have to deal with as an entrepreneur. But one of my strategies is I'm not in a rush anywhere. I really want to enjoy the process. And some days that means I'm failing miserably and I'm completely outside of my depth. But if I just go for that area, that space where there's something called optimal anxiety, meaning what you're doing is not in a calm state that you're not engaged, but it's also not so hard that you are freaking the hell out constantly. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so it's this optimal level of anxiety. And we found that people tend to learn best and engage the most when you can put them in this state. It's when you're excited. It's not when let's say you're relatively new at your company and somebody tells you that you're going to be pitching to the CEO. You get really excited and engaged. You don't waste any time. You're super focused on the task at hand, and you're like totally committed not to screw it up and just do a phenomenal job. But if somebody told you that you're going to be presenting like your industry's world conference on a stage in front of thousands of people, that might be so much pressure at this young point in your career that you crumble. Mm-hmm. So you really want to find that state of what's called optimal anxiety.
I like that a lot. I find it so interesting, Jon, that essentially we were so interested in adventure last time that we didn't go into this whole kind of huge aspect of how you come to it. And, you are an adventurous guy and all that, but really you come at this from a behavior standpoint and behavioral economics and all of that. So tell us a little bit, how did you get into this? How does one get into the career of interpreting research and applying it and writing on this whole different broad area? I think it's fascinating that your work is interpreting and applying research.
So the truth of it is kind of embarrassing. The reason I think I went into it is because I grew up so incredibly unpopular that I thought maybe if I understood people, I could make a friend or two.
Oh, I get that.
I tried to develop these behavioral models to figure people out. And then I discovered that there are actually scientists that do this, right? Because when, like in 8th grade, my teacher walked in and she said, "We're throwing out the seating chart today." And she gave each student the option to pick 2 people they want to sit with and 2 people they don't want to sit with. And I discovered 2 things that day. One was that there was one student that nobody wanted to sit with. And the second was that student was me. Mm-hmm. And so I was totally heartbroken. But I was like, I'm going to figure this out. And I think I'm still trying to figure it out, to be honest. Luckily, I think
you're very, very, very humble. I know you, and I know your reputation precedes you as kind of hosting some of the best dinners in New York and having one of the best social circles. So, without taking the whole interview in that direction, I want to ask you. For me, I have a very similar story. Our kind of doppelganger similarity continues, and for me, the big pivotal game-changing books were not so much research-based, but rather things like Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. So I want to ask you from that 13-year-old kid sitting in the classroom realizing that was you to where you are now, and just the level of social success that you've enjoyed, what were the stepping stones? What were the tools that you used to get from A to B?
So I just want to quickly speak to what you just mentioned, which was Dale Carnegie's book. I recently reread it, and although his approach was collecting wisdom from across the ages and researching it thoroughly, it wasn't science-based, but everything he talks about, I know of research that backs it. Right. And so I consider it one of the best books on behavioral science, even though it wouldn't pass the mark of referenced scientific research. Mm-hmm. So phenomenal. And listeners, if you haven't read it, I consider it a mandatory book, not only to read, but to review every 5 years or so.
Agreed.
So in terms of stepping stones, what got me there? I realized that every time I'd get into a conversation with somebody, I would reference science as my base point of comparison. And so people kept being like, well, why don't you, are you going to pursue a degree in psychology or something? I'm like, no, I don't think so. And I eventually got picked up to work at a company called Rodale, which owns Men's Health, Women's Health, Runner's World, like all the fitness magazines. But they have a science team that works for them. And there's essentially people who have PhD in library sciences. And I would be working on a strategic project for a client of Rodale's, right? So a brand will come to Rodale and say, hey, you understand the health and fitness audience. How can we engage them? How can we produce content for them? And I was in charge of developing the strategies. So I'd email the research team and I'd say, hey, can you get me all the studies on these topics? And then I'd sit there for like hours and just read study after study and develop the strategies from that. I realized I have a real knack for this. And I retained all of the research. And on top of that, every book I was reading was research-based. And so I was approached by a neuroscientist by the name of Moran Cerf. He's absolutely brilliant researcher. You've definitely heard about his work at some point. And he said, I want you to do work out of my lab. I want you to pursue a PhD in neuroscience. And I was like, listen, I don't know if I want to do this. And he's like, no, just start doing research with me and we'll take it from there. And we've done some great work together. We were just talking about one of the latest things we did was we looked at 431 million potential matches in mobile dating and found patterns in what causes people to date each other. So we found patterns in introversion and extroversion, or if you have the same initials, you're 11.3% more likely to date one another. It's called implicit egotism. Anything that reminds us of ourselves is more attractive. And I loved it so much, I started doing all these research projects and consulting for companies like Retail Me Not and Samsung and so on.
Fascinating. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a really, really tough question, Jon, which is, we've talked about psychology of adventure a little bit, and we've talked a little bit about influence. I want to ask you, if you were doing a greatest hits album over the last decade of your career and you were coming out with kind of the actionable stuff. So my big takeaway from our previous episode, to give you an example of kind of what I'm looking for, was quit at the peak of the night, right? And since speaking with you, I've read this so many other different places, including in Yuval Noah Harari's book, where he talks about you remember the last part of an experience. So like even if your colonoscopy is longer, if the last part isn't that painful, you'll remember the whole part is not painful. So quit at the peak of the night. What are some other kind of actionable things that we can do in our day-to-day lives to kind of hack this behavioral element and leverage psychology to lead better lives or have better relationships?
So let's start off with top 5. If there's time for more, we'll dig in.
Love it.
Okay. So first and foremost, we have to accept a few things about human behavior. One is we are not logical. We're emotional. And then we justify our emotional decisions based on logic. So when you're having a bad day and you buy yourself something, you're not doing it because logically you need the thing. You're doing it because it's retail therapy. So that's the context for this conversation, is that don't expect human beings to be logical. We have all these different sections of the brain that are constantly battling each other for control, and sometimes certain parts win out over others. So now let's get into the basics. 1, sleep is by far the most important bedrock of functionality. You could go a day without eating or 2 days without eating, but if you do the same without sleep, you are essentially beyond drunk and non-functional. Anybody who tells you that they can get by with like 4 hours of sleep or something like that, experiments were done on surgeons to see if they can get away with it, and ultimately it affects them, even though they might think that it doesn't. The percentage of the population that are super sleepers, meaning people who can sleep sub 4 hours and be completely alert and fine, rounded to the nearest whole number, is 0. So they exist. There's a genetic marker for it, but you're probably not a super sleeper, so get a full night's sleep. Anytime you cut down your sleep, you are losing productivity and focus.
Absolutely.
Now, that being said, we have a limited capacity for focus. And an experiment was done on the Israeli parole board, and they looked at what causes people to get parole. And so imagine you're a convicted felon, you're coming in for parole, there's a parole board hearing, and so what's the defining characteristic? And what they found was shocking. You'd expect it would be remorse, good behavior, all that. It was time of day. So if you were first in the morning or first after lunch, you had the highest chances of getting parole, and it steadily went down as the day progressed. And so if you need to make critical decisions, or if you need to convince a client of something, the times that people are most open-minded are when they have the most cognitive capacity. And that is when they've burnt out the least. So make sure that you use your alert hours the best you can. And if you look at a book called The Power of When, it's an examination of our predispositions to genetic sleep patterns, meaning some of us are awake super early in the morning and that's our most productive time. Some of us are like night owls. They're called wolves. And, you'll often see musicians cranking out songs at 2, 3, 4 in the morning. And some of us are never sleep well, while others, have a general alertness at about 8 or 9. And so you really have to cherish those peak production hours and not let anybody get near them. Then we can get into a whole slew of different things. One of the most important characteristics of human beings that I've come across is something called the IKEA effect. And this was popularized by Dan Ariely in one of his books. The research was actually led by someone else, but he was on the research team. And they examined the impact that effort has on caring for something or valuing it. And what they found is that people disproportionately care for their IKEA furniture or value it because they had to assemble it. Mm-hmm. And so anything we put effort into, we care more about. That means friendships. So there's something called the Ben Franklin effect, which is if you do me a favor, you'll like me more because you put the effort into the relationship. It could mean something as simple as asking someone to take a survey on my product. The fact that they've invested effort and given feedback on it means that they'll value the product more. But have you ever noticed that if you go to a party and there's a gift bag and you get all this stuff, you generally don't really care about it?
Yep.
But if you had to put the effort to earn it and work hard to get it, you would really value it.
Wow, that's so true. I brought home this gourd from Summit. I did a survival workshop at Summit. There's this hideous gourd, that I made for carrying water in the event of an apocalypse. And I kept it for a year till eventually I was like, God, this thing is hideous. Why do I have this? And it was exactly that.
Yep. We care about what we put effort into. That's why if children are switched at birth, the parents that raised them still care about them. It's not the genetic. They don't just abandon them because they're like, this isn't my genetic relative. So the key is either get your customers to put in effort. If you want to build relationships with people, get them to put effort into you. It's completely fine to ask for favors. And one of the things that got me over that hump of not wanting to do it all alone is realizing that for a functional society, we all have to depend on one another. And so if I can get people to put effort into me and I put effort into them, it's healthy to build community. And it'll all work out.
I like that because it can sound, if someone's listening from the side, it can sound manipulative. I guess not manipulative, but very conniving. And I like, because you and I have both done the work to figure out how am I going to get along with people better and how am I going to be a better leader and a better entrepreneur? I like that aspect where it's if everyone behaved this way, it's not conniving or manipulative. The world would be a better place.
Yeah. Ultimately, here's one of the funny things about our species. If a deer has, I think a fawn is what a baby deer, right?
I think so, yeah.
So a fawn within minutes of birth can run. Human beings, I'm assuming because we have such large heads, need to be born prematurely before we're fully functional, and then need to be raised for a decade plus until we can care for ourselves. So it means that we're highly dependent on other members of our community. We even say, it takes a village to raise a child? Mm-hmm. So it's not surprising that we reward cooperation and support. And it releases oxytocin in our brain, which, if you've ever read Paul J. Zach's book, The Moral Molecule, it builds connections between people. Right? It's the neurotransmitter that a mother's brain releases when she first holds her child that bonds them. So I believe that anything you want to accomplish is a byproduct of who you know and how much you trust each other. And so building meaningful relationships only helps serve everybody accomplishing what it is that they care about.
Wow. I really like that. I want to ask you, because knowing you and us having a lot of mutual friends in the Summit community and things like that, you seem to so naturally work a social situation. I've heard your salon dinners be called, some of the best, most important, most networked, most wonderful dinners in New York City and so on and so forth. How much of this at this point is second nature to you? And how much of it is still looking at this as a behavioral expert?
So I think that I'll try and separate a couple of things. There's some aspect of me that's fundamentally built on this insecurity of wanting to be liked. I would be lying if I pretended there was anything else going on to some degree. And I genuinely enjoy caring for people, taking care of them and contributing to them. And so one of my friends, I was taking a walk with my friend Robbie, and she said, the only reason that any of this works is because you really want to give and you don't have an angle for it. Right? a lot of the time that I help people, and I'm sure you do this too, and I think a lot of entrepreneurs end up doing this, especially those who've had a bit of successes. There's this real desire to give back, this desire to impact somebody else's life, mentor them to some degree, whatever it is that you want to call. And I love the idea that I can introduce two people and their futures are now different and I don't have to make any more effort, right? They take it from here and the world's now different. And it's all because of a quick email, an exchange of information of some kind. And the world has been impacted. Now, I'm by no stretch of the imagination am I like, impacting the world on a global scale, but I still feel like that's my biggest contribution. There's some people who are much wealthier, who can donate tons of money. There are people who are much smarter, who can provide strategies or access. But what I really do well is I connect people. And I feel like that's my gift to other people. And so I think that that's one of the reasons that it works is that I think I do it from a perspective of really caring and wanting to do it. If my angle was like, oh my God, I'm going to get all this money from people, my hunch is that at the level that the guests that I invite operate, they would probably see through that. It'd be hard to fool the 1,200 people that I've invited.
Wow.
Rather, the 1,200 people who've attended the dinners, and then probably 6,000 people have come to the Mirror of the Salon series.
Wow. Tell us some of talking about relationships and the value of this, I guess, ability, I would say, that you have. Tell us some of the kind of most interesting things that have come out of salon dinners or out of introductions that you've made.
So I would first of all say that this was very much a learned skill, but it's beneficial that I actually really care about people. And I think that anybody can, assuming they actually do care about people, can learn it. I think first and foremost, it falls into two categories. One is the impact that the content that's been shared has had. And then the other is the impact that the relationships have had. So on the content side, we often try to highlight nonprofits, social issues, creatives, books, anything that you could imagine. And I know that new TV shows have been created as a byproduct. Companies have been funded. Massive amounts of donations have been done for nonprofits. All of these things took place because when you can create a community, there's a desire to support it. On the relationship side, I know people have dated, which is super funny to me because nobody ever tells me these things. So I'll see people at a party later on and be like, what's going on here? And they say, oh, we met at your event. And now we're like, a year and a half in. So that type of stuff definitely happens. Lots and lots of business has taken place. People have become speakers at national conferences. What else? Major corporations got their marketing strategy from, one of the dinner like anything you could imagine. I think people have participated on musical tracks with the Grammy-winning artists. They've definitely gotten booked for tours. Lots of people have been booked for talks. So it's a lot around the thought leadership space.
So I want to bring it back and ask, because I think for a lot of people in the audience, it's very clear the benefits of building this kind of relationship network. And how did you get started with this? I mean, at some point you were just some dude who was trying to improve his social skills and you decided to host a dinner. You decided to create a community, create a network. Where does it all start?
So to give the listeners a sense of the scope, for the past 8 years, I've been running a private community comprised of everything from Olympic medalists, Nobel laureates, editors-in-chiefs of most of the major magazines across the U.S., famous scientists, executives, presidents of television networks, Academy Award winners, all that kind of stuff. And when I started it, I was, and I still don't think I'm that impressive, was 28 years old. And I knew some people, but I didn't grow up like hanging out with, there's certain people who their family knows everybody, I didn't come from one of those families. My dad was an artist from the Yemenite quarter of Tel Aviv. And he was one of 12 kids. He was born in the house he grew up in. It's not, he was able to become a pretty successful artist, but, it's not like the traditional story you would think. I didn't have access. I'll grow up with it. And I was essentially working middle management somewhere. And I got really inspired by a seminar I was doing. And the seminar leader said the fundamental element that defines the quality of our lives are the people we surround ourselves with and the conversations that we have with them. And I was curious how accurate this was. So, of course, I turned to research. And there's this really phenomenal study by Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler. They were curious about the obesity epidemic. And as an epidemic, they were curious, does obesity pass from person to person, or is it a percentage of the population? And what they found was crazy, that obesity is contagious. So if you have a friend who's obese, your chances of obesity increase by 45%. Your friends who don't know that person, their chances increase by 25%, their friends by 10%, and their friends by 5%. So we each have an effect 4 degrees out. And this is true for anything from health and fitness to marriage and divorce rates, smoking habits, anything you could imagine. And so I said, how do I bring together the most extraordinary people in our culture so that they could have an impact on not just my life, but on each other? Ultimately, if you look at a really healthy network, it's not about you being in the center of it and everybody knowing you. It's about everybody being connected to everyone else. That way they can all have a positive impact on one another. And so I became kind of obsessed with this idea of effective curation. And I looked at what research could do to help me connect with these thought leaders and these executives. And I developed essentially a collection of best practices around that.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about those because I've hosted. So ironically and coincidentally, I also host a dinner called Salon Tuesdays, but it ends up just being my same circle of friends every week. And so I'm very interested in, how you applied research towards expanding your network, and not in a self-serving way, but in this organic, beneficial for everyone way.
Yeah. And let me be really clear. This has served me incredibly well. I wouldn't have had a book deal if I didn't build my network. I wouldn't have been the only probably scientist at the Emmys and the Grammys this year, right? I end up getting to hop in and out of communities that I'm fundamentally just not a part of. I wouldn't have a TV show in the works if I didn't know how to build a community. And so I think the first thing that I will say is that I am willing to look like an idiot. I am willing to embarrass the heck out of myself. When I was first starting out, before I really understood what I was doing, I'd walk up to literally everyone and just start talking about this dinner, just like every entrepreneur needs to do when they're figuring out how to explain their company. But what I would do is each person I spoke to, I would present it in a different way, and I would learn how to present it in a way that makes sense for a specific audience. So when I went up to Ewan McGregor at Sundance one time, I was testing out something completely insane. And I said to him, I'm going to say 3 sentences. He doesn't know me, of course. I'm going to say 3 sentences. And when I'm done, you're going to ask to cook me dinner. And I gave my spiel, and he's like, you see that person over there? That's my agent. You guys figure it out. I want to come.
What were the 3 sentences?
It was something to the extent of, for the past, at the time, it was 6 years or whatever, I've been running a secret dining experience where nobody's allowed to talk about what they do or give their last name. They cook dinner together, and when they sit down to eat, everybody gets to guess what everybody else does. That's when they find out they're sitting with Nobel laureates, Olympic medalists, editor-in-chief of a major magazine, the president of a television network, Academy Award-winning actor, musician. And if you'd like to come, I'll make sure you get an invite.
Wow. I mean, it's very clear that you've used behavioral psychology in every aspect of this, right? It's leaving some to be desired, leaving an element of mystery, selling the benefits very clearly.
So there's something called information gap theory. It was developed by George Lowenstein. I think it was 1994. Lowenstein theorized a new model for understanding how curiosity works. And he theorized that since it's more like an itch you can't scratch rather than joyful and really pleasant, then the way that it functions is to pull you in, right? You're annoyed when you don't know the information. Mm-hmm. But there's a key way that it works. If I present you with something that's really familiar, so let's say you stepped out while the game was going on, whatever game it was, and I tell you, oh, the team scored, it doesn't really create any curiosity because there wasn't much of a gap between your knowledge and what you're being presented with. You knew there was a game going on, so on. If the gap is too big, so we're at a party and some guy's talking to us about the particulars of mold injection design, we're like, okay, let's get the hell out of here. Because the gap is too big for us to span and it doesn't make any sense to us. We want to avoid it. But if the gap is big enough that it raises curiosity, but not so big that it scares us, we have to understand what's going on. And so if I can develop some curiosity, you'll want to engage with it. It's how like BuzzFeed titles work, right? So like 42 uses for a banana and number 5 will shock you. I doubt number 5 will actually shock you. But now curiosity has been created.
Fascinating. I mean, I get the impression that you kind of go about your daily life keeping these in mind. And again, I identify with that. You know, I'm notorious for like not having the good body language before and not having the eloquent speaking skills. And I very deliberately, you know, correct my body language when I'm in public. And I very deliberately, when I'm giving a lecture, pay attention to my enunciation and the way that I'm moving my diaphragm. I mean, as you go throughout the day, are these kinds of the things that you're thinking about? And are you saying to yourself, okay, well, let me not give too much information because I want this person to kind of be drawn into this idea?
So I would say a few things. One is behavioral science is great on people, not person. So did you grow up in America at all?
I did, yeah. I grew up in California.
Okay, so if you were the average American, you'd be obese and like, you know, I don't know, based on your age, statistically speaking, you might be Latino, right? Like I think that's the fastest kind of growing segment. But you're not a statistic. You don't read at like a 7th grade reading level or whatever the average American reads at. So behavioral science works on large numbers. And there's some general concepts that like hold true, like the peak end rule, which you talked about earlier, or the IKEA effect. But it's near impossible for me to predict your behavior because there are too many outlying characteristics that make you the human being. So a lot of behavioral science doesn't really, at least not for me, work while I'm in conversation because I can't both be analyzing the conversation and be present to it at the same time. And so what I do instead is I engineer scenarios to elicit a specific response. The same way Disney theme parks engineer an experience so that to create joy and happiness for children, I design the dinner to elicit a response of community. I attempt to design my salon series Mirror in a way that elicits a response of wonder or curiosity and playfulness to entertain and enlighten people. And that's, I think, the best application is in engineering social experiences and less so trying to get one specific person to do something.
I like that. Okay, I can handle that. And I think it's worth noting, you know, that a lot of the stuff that we're talking about is kind of things that masters do intentionally, right? So when you talk about correcting body language as one example, all you're doing is embracing body language that someone who has naturally confident kind of charisma does naturally. And it's, you know, by, for example, showing that you care and showing that you want to create value for people, you're just doing what the world's friendliest, most social people do naturally.
Yeah. Well, you know, I wear a Lumo lift. It's this thing that vibrates when I slouch. And I do that for your precise reason, right? It's a functional reminder to systematically improve my posture. One, because it's healthier for me. And two, it emotes something about me that I prefer. I very much believe in all those kinds of things, like behavioral modification stuff. But it's fundamentally behavioral modification is hard, right? Habit forming is hard. There are these misconceptions. If you actually read The Power of Habit, they talk about how this misconception that it takes 21 days to develop a habit. That there's no evidence of that whatsoever. The evidence is that it's somewhere around 66 days. There's a lot of like BS science that floats around. So, for example, people talk about this Harvard study that followed people throughout the course of their lives, and those who wrote down their goals were significantly more likely to fulfill on them. That study never happened. Like there's literally, it's one of these like famous examples of the rumors being much greater than anything actually happening in history. But people then develop beliefs that have nothing to do with reality. Will writing down your goals make you more productive? I'm sure it will. Will it guarantee that you'll be a success? I don't know. There's so many mitigating circumstances, ranging from the family that you were born to, the education you have, the amount of grit you have. It's near impossible to predict success.
Wow. I like that. I want to ask you, I see we're kind of running low on time here. So I wanted to ask just before we get into the wrap-up questions, are there any other kind of performance enhancing adaptations that you've come upon? I mean, we've talked about so many different things like sleep, but are there any other things that you do based on your research background that help you perform at a higher level?
So there's two things. One, to connect with people, it's really about familiarity, right? I discussed the study about the initials. Coke saw its, I think, biggest gains when they started putting names on cans. And that's because you associate emotionally to it. Oh, I have a friend named Joe, I'll buy it for him. So anything that could remind people of something familiar, then it's more likely to be appealing to them. And in fact, there were experiments about combining people's photos with another person and making them look a little bit more like you. And as a result, they liked the person more. And then last but not least, performance enhancing. There's something called ART, also known as attention restoration theory, where at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, they had people come in, take a cognitive test, and then take a walk, either through nature or through busy downtown Ann Arbor. And what they found was when they came back and took a test, people who spent time in nature had higher cognitive test results. It turns out, and what they believe is that our directed attention, our focus, has a limited ability throughout the day. And since we were not designed to get all these notifications, alarms, all this kind of stuff, then when we are exposed to nature, it resets us to a large degree. That taking a walk through a natural environment that's quieter and leaving your phone behind and all those things allow you to reset. And in fact, when you are alone and not engaging with technology, there's a section or a system in the brain called the default mode network. It's often associated with mind wandering. And in this state, areas of the brain that are generally not active at the same time are. And people often report saying, oh, the idea came to me in the shower or when I was taking a walk. And the reason is that mind wandering is, I'd argue, very healthy and can instigate creativity and can allow you to process things that when you're bombarded doesn't happen. And so I recently took a very long walk across El Camino de Santiago. It's a pilgrimage, 780 kilometers. I did 118. And it was, in the first day, I had like 5 or 6 ideas that completely changed my business. But that's because I'm usually so tired and so engaged and connected with things that I don't have any time to just let my mind wander.
Absolutely. I always have my best ideas, exactly as you said, in the shower.
And so one of the things I'd encourage people to do, leave your phone, take a walk. Don't allow, and when I say take a walk in a park.
Yeah, not in the middle of the city.
Yeah.
Yeah, so really, really quickly, Jon, I know we've run out of time here, so I want to give you an opportunity. If people want to reach out and learn more, I know you've got some new projects coming out soon, but we'll have you back on the show to talk about that. So where should people reach out and learn more about you?
So my handle is Jon Levy, TLB, JONLEVY, T like Thomas, L like Lion, B like Boy, Jon Levy, TLB. And I can be found on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and jonlevytlb.com if you want to read my latest articles. I also contribute across Inc., Entrepreneur, Fortune, Forbes, any place that you could imagine. I probably do an article or two for them every month. So, and all of it's backed by behavior science.
Brilliant. We'll link all that up in the podcast. And last question, if people take away one big lesson from this episode, what would you hope for that to be?
The fundamental element that defines the quality of your life are the people you surround yourself with and the conversations that you have with them. So become masterful at curating the people in your life, and you'll never regret it.
Fantastic. Jon Levy, I appreciate it again. Always a pleasure to chat with you, and I do hope we keep in touch.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's been a treat.
Take care, my friend. See ya. All right, super friends, that is all we have for you today, but I hope you guys really enjoyed the show, and I hope you learned a ton of actionable information, tips, advice that will help you go out there and overcome the impossible. If you've enjoyed the show, please take a moment to leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher, or drop us a quick little note on the Twitter machine at GoSuperHuman. Also, if you have any ideas for anyone out there who you would love to see on the show, we always love to hear your recommendations. You can submit on our website, or you can just drop us an email and let us know. That's all for today, guys. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for tuning in to the Becoming Superhuman podcast. For more great skills and strategies, or for links to any of the resources mentioned in this episode, visit www.becomingasuperhuman.com/podcast. We'll see you next time.